Tears of the Kingdom is the long-awaited sequel to the genre-defining game that was Breath of the Wild. When Breath of the Wild released, the open-world landscape changed forever, and clones of it started appearing left and right, and its inspirations are evident in games that release even today. Now, I didn't jump onto the hype train of Breath of the Wild until after the release of Tears of the Kingdom, and if you want to know more about my thoughts on that game, then be sure to check out that video after this one. Once I finished Breath of the Wild, I went straight into Tears of the Kingdom to see how it measures up. After all, how could any game possibly follow up one of the most popular video games of all time that shifted the gaming landscape itself? Now, I'm a casual gamer, so I don't know all the things, I don't do research, and I'm not the best at playing the game, but I do have opinions, so here we are. In today's video, we're going to take a look at two overarching aspects of the game and all the various aspects involved in them. Those aspects are adventure and combat, and then we'll talk about a few noteworthy details at the end. Our objective with talking about these parts of the game is to answer the question, did this sequel deserve to be made? Essentially, are we just rehashing the same game with a new coat of paint, or is Tears of the Kingdom going to live up to the legacy left behind by Breath of the Wild? So let's grab a bag of popcorn and strap in as we start talking about it, because this is going to be a long one. Also, there will be spoilers for just about every part of the game, so yeah. First up, we'll talk about the adventure of Tears of the Kingdom, in which we'll talk about Sky Islands, the underground, the surface, shrines, temples, and of course the all-important horse, and probably a few other things along the way. We'll talk about them in that order, so we'll leap into what may very well have been the most striking difference between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and that's the Sky Islands. Or at least, it seemed that way to me when watching the promotions for the game. This also bears out in how you start the game, in the skies. Well, actually, I suppose there's a short section beforehand that starts up the story, but that's besides the point, I think. After all, if you've seen any of my videos, you know I'm the guy who doesn't pay attention to the story, so we wake up and discover our arm is now looking a little funny. After a little walking, you come out to the open air, and it's pretty cool, though I think they didn't nearly capture the same awe as Breath of the Wild did, although I must admit that this could have been because I spoiled the cutscene they have. Before I jumped, I checked out the view for myself before the title card appeared. When you land, you are now in the place I'd learned to call Tutorial Island. Just like Breath of the Wild, you start the game in an extended section where you have to deal with 3 shrines, including one that's in a cold biome. In Breath of the Wild, this part took me maybe an hour or 2, while in Tears of the Kingdom, this took me closer to 3 or 4 hours, and I felt every minute of it. This game did have more to introduce you to, but there are several points where I was confused as to where I needed to go just to reach the shrine I could see in the distance, and sometimes you'd have to backtrack across the entire island because I went in the wrong direction. Tutorial Island took quite a bit longer than I'd have liked, but it was serviceable. After finishing the game, I was shocked to learn that I spent a 10th of my playtime on this island. I would say this is too long, and I do still kinda think that, but at least this tutorial isn't quite the same as your average tutorial that feels it necessary to hold your hand. There are some parts where it spells out things for you, and well, maybe it does spell out most of it for you, but most of the time on this island is spent testing the limits of your abilities. Now that's a lot of talking about just the tutorial island, but if you've played the game, you know there's a whole lot more of those floating chunks of Earth in the sky. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to drag you through a step-by-step explanation of everything I did during the whole run. The reason I went to such length into talking about the tutorial island is because I didn't really spend all that much time on these islands afterwards. It actually took me until about 10 hours into the run before I figured out that the chunks of rock that fall from the sky can be time reversed, bringing you back to the sky. For a while, I was quite lost as to how one would even get to those islands. But then I discovered this kind of obvious solution. And when I did use this ability to check out a few islands, I guess there were some interesting things I found, like Sage's Wills, which I think are an alternative version of the Spirit Orbs from Shrines, and some gave me old maps, but I didn't discover those until late in the run. Other than that, there were these gumball machines that refilled my machine arsenal, but I overall saw little point in trying to get to these islands. The loot was most often not worth it, and sometimes there wasn't anything to be had at all. The most useful thing about the islands was probably just that they could be used as a launching off point to pass over mountains, cliffs, and canyons without going through the pain of climbing up and around it all. Granted, these islands were pretty, and I'm a big fan of floating islands in any game. I just never felt much of a need to go to the skies and see what the islands had. Although there were several times I was actually interested in checking out these islands because it had a weird shape or just looked interesting, and then either I'd get distracted by things on the surface or else I could never find a convenient way up to the island without walking around forever, hoping for a rock to fall from the sky, and then was also the kind of rock that would bring me high enough to reach the island in the first place, since some of these rocks appear out of thin air and drop onto the earth. So the Sky Islands were a cool idea, but were kind of just meh. Now what about the underground areas? I actually don't know if the space beneath Hyrule has a name, so for our purposes today, we'll call it the Deep, and if it does have a name and it's said frequently, I apologize. I guess I just never saw it or just don't remember it. This is a part of the game that came out of left field for me. I only remember seeing things about Sky Islands, and the idea there was basically a second map beneath the surface boggled my mind. The first time I went down here, I was genuinely scared of what I was looking at, and it didn't help that a giant glowing toad could be seen as I descended to the surface. This place has a spooky atmosphere and is highly dangerous. All the enemies will not only cause you to lose health, but will also deal damage that prevents your hearts from regenerating unless you eat a certain kind of food or reach one of the massive seeds sprawled around the underground. There is also all kinds of goop in the area that does the same thing. I like the atmosphere of the Deep, and because it took away your hearts, it was genuinely dangerous to be in. Despite this cool atmosphere though, I was once again disinterested in exploring since I didn't find all that much down there. There are little shrine things that have non-corroded weapons, which is very nice. There are some structures that have something to do with the silly red eye cult guys, but overall I didn't spend much time down here because I didn't see much of a reason to. I think that one thing that holds it back is also the fact that you can't see much of anything. You have to use some sort of light source to see down here, and although that makes it more scary, it also meant that I may not have seen many of the interesting things that were down here. I'm pretty sure that might not be the case though, since there were plenty of structures in the Deep that I could see, and they always had some sort of light source around them, so they stuck out. It is then possible, I suppose, that the real reason I didn't try to explore was because the darkness made it hard to judge distance, and I didn't feel like making a long trip to explore something that almost never reaped a worthwhile reward. Now the surface, the place where you'll spend the bulk of your time in all likelihood. I really like the surface, and it clearly is where you're meant to spend most of your time since it has the most to do. But I suppose there isn't too much to say here because it's largely the same as the surface in Breath of the Wild. Stables and towers are very similar to last time, but are now maybe in different locations, and towers require annoying side quests on occasion. Also, stables will give you horse or stable points or whatever they were called. If you played Breath of the Wild recently, and of course I'd fall into that category, then you'll notice a lot of similarities and see many familiar sights. There are plenty of changes made to the landscape after the upheaval, the name the game gives to the Sky Islands appearing and all that. And this does make it more fresh, but it's pretty similar to Breath of the Wild in many ways. There are chunks of land missing or added from floating islands, but it also just felt like some areas looked different, but this could just be my imagination. Probably the most noteworthy difference between the surface of both games is the fact that Tears of the Kingdom adds outposts and war parties, or at least that's what I'm calling them. Outposts are monster forts with, well, a lot of monsters who you can slay inside, and there is usually a prisoner to free and loot to acquire. But I don't care about the nerd sitting in a cage waiting to be eaten. I'm here to slay monsters, and these outposts scratch that itch. I really like these. Of course, this would also mean I quite enjoyed the war parties. There were basically mini quests where you'd come across a small war party who request your help in defeating a horde of enemies. The first one was also before I had taken down any anomalies, and having the spirit ability things would make it a lot easier, but all around it was a great experience. I just wish there were more of these because I only encountered one other, and that one I cleared first try, sadly. I'm sure there are way more of these missions if I were to search for them, but I only ever found 2. Other than those 2 monster-related differences though, I didn't feel like the surface was wildly different. For all I know, the landscape of the 2 games could be entirely different, but since they have a similar art style, it felt like the same place to me. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. Next up is shrines, and these are, once again, very similar to the ones in Breath of the Wild. They do add a few more variations to the shrines, and there are no tests of strength, or if there are, there's very few when compared to Breath of the Wild. I must admit, I kind of liked the shrines in Breath of the Wild that tested your strength, so to speak. They were short and to the point, but also Tears of the Kingdom shrines all felt more unique than the ones in Breath of the Wild. Sometimes this came to their detriment though. Especially early in the game when I was just learning how to play, there were several shrines that totally stumped me. If I hadn't live streamed the experience and had chat members who knew the answers to several of the shrines, I would never have solved them. I do stream these games on Kick, by the way, so if you want to see me try these games live, then follow me there. Link in the description if that helps. Overall, I think I enjoyed these shrines more, though they definitely were more difficult than the ones in Breath of the Wild most of the time. And this is mostly just because there is a lot more openness to how puzzles can be solved in Tears of the Kingdom. Since you can build things and move them around like you never could in Breath of the Wild, there were more puzzles that required you to think in different ways, and put simply, I'm not very good at puzzles, especially in video games. There were some shrines that I really enjoyed, which would strip you of everything you had and give you only a few wooden tools to work with, and then would have you do some sort of challenge, usually involving combat. I liked these, though some of them were a bit frustrating. Overall, I think I enjoyed them just as much as the ones in Breath of the Wild, if not more, and I also felt like there were more of them. Maybe that's because there were more places to put shrines, but it just felt like I was finding them all over the place, and unlike Breath of the Wild, I hardly ever skipped over them for a lack of interest. I was actually more happy to interact with shrines in Tears of the Kingdom than Breath of the Wild, though that might be because it felt much more necessary to increase my hearts and stamina in this one than, well, Breath of the Wild. Now let's finally discuss temples, and before getting to the temple for each location, we'll talk about the region that they're in. Now I played Tears of the Kingdom in the reverse order I played Breath of the Wild, meaning I went to Gerudo Desert first, then the Goron, then Rito Village, and finally to the Zora, and we'll talk about them in that order. Gerudo Desert was a lot better, I felt, in this one than Breath of the Wild, since you didn't have to worry about finding a way to dress like a lady. Instead, you could just walk into the village and not be bothered by anyone. What I really loved, though, was that there was a desert storm that removed your ability to use your map to navigate, so you were more or less entirely blind. There were dust devils scattered around that would let you float into the air to get your bearings, but I liked how this disoriented you and made you think more carefully about where you were going. This was also helped along by the fact that the enemies around here are actually terrifying. The first time I saw one in the distance, I thought I was looking at Slenderman or something. And then it turns out only weapons with an elemental ability can really harm them. Although that never really came into effect for me, since I attacked him with an elemental weapon right from the get-go and thus didn't even notice they had immunity to other weapons until after I'd gotten used to them. Inside the village, you learn about what happened, and then you have to do a short wave battle where you learn how to use the princess's abilities, and after that you face a sort of tower defense, but not a tower defense event. The first time I tried this, I was confused since I shot shock arrows at the towers and they didn't explode, so I assumed I couldn't destroy them, only to learn later that I had to shoot them at a specific time. After learning that, it wasn't a very tough battle, but I spent quite a while on this not knowing how to win. After that, you have to find and move these mirrors to finally reveal a temple. The boss attacks you before you enter, and it's the only boss that does this for some reason. It retreats before you kill it, and into the temple you go. The desert temple starts pretty strong, I think, with heavy Egyptian temple inspirations with traps and corridors all around, but eventually you come up to an open area and you have to shine lights into different spots to unlock the boss door. This temple was a little tough since I did one light and then couldn't for the life of me figure out where the others were for the longest time. This temple is a bit of a maze and it takes a second to get from place to place, so backtracking to see if I missed something burnt a lot of time. Not a great first temple, but at least there was a temple. We'll talk about the boss fights too later in the video when we discuss combat. So right now we're going to move on to the Gorons in the kind of volcano area, whatever that's called. And overall, I found the exploration of this part of the land to be pretty bland, There wasn't all that much to it, but some wandering into a few caves, so we're going to skip over talking about it. The only thing to note was that there was a few story beats during this part of the game that made Zelda actually seem evil. The times before where you see the shadow of her wandering around made her seem mysterious, but with the Goron, she came off as plain evil. The temple in this area is of course the Fire Temple, and I thought the lead up to this one was absolutely amazing. The first step is beating some sort of mini-boss that erupts out of the volcano, and you're just given a fighter jet and you just shoot the thing. This part disappointed me though, because I wanted to fly the gosh darn jet for longer. It was so much fun, but it was over in 3 shots, so pretty quick fight. Once that boss, or mini-boss, whatever it is down, you head into the volcano and have to find the temple somewhere in the deep. I didn't see any clear signs of it at first, so I was a bit lost at the start, but there was some big seeds in the vicinity, so I figured going to those was a good first step, and of course, that was a good first step, but before I got to the temple, I found this Colosseum, which was a lot of fun. Hopefully I remember to mention that during the combat section of this video. Once we got into the Fire Temple, you quickly learned that it is heavily centered around using minecart tracks, and if I'm honest, I hated minecart tracks in this game. Riding in them wasn't exactly a whole lot of fun and required a few steps to ride just the simple ones, and sometimes a bunch of steps to ride the more complicated ones. I never fully grasped them, and I think overall I wasn't interested in sitting a cart and watching it move me around. Sure, the Goron would sit in front of the minecart and act as a turret, but that didn't make it all that much more exciting. Now at this point in the game, I had invested most of my orbs into stamina, and this temple is where I learned that lots of stamina is stupidly nice to have. I couldn't figure out for the life of me how to use some of the minecarts to reach certain areas I needed to get to, so instead I would brute force my way with climbing and ascending. So I may not have solved it the way it was intended, but it was done, I guess. The boss for this temple was also one of the least interesting ones I felt, but once again we'll get to the bosses during the combat section of this video. The next anomaly to check off the list is the Rito Village. Unlike last time, getting to the village feels considerably easy, but it's also just the beginning. After talking to some bird, you are sent on a wild goose chase, trying to find the kid who ran off. You're supposed to follow these fires, and there are a few, but at one point I couldn't figure out where the next one in line was, and just started climbing upwards, figuring the top of the mountain was where I needed to go, and sure enough it was. You then keep on going up because the bird people's temple is, of course, in the sky in the eye of what looks like a hurricane. To get there, you have to navigate a bunch of floating islands and jump on these boats that have trampolines for sails. Don't ask me why. Overall, this was a much more fun area than just riding a bunch of minecarts. Still think that Gerudo Desert had the most interesting pre-temple gameplay, but this was fine. Eventually, you fly above the storm and fall down into the massive floating air temple. I honestly can't remember a whole lot from this temple, at least not anything that is worth mentioning. It was the simplest to navigate in my opinion, and I'm pretty sure I spent the least amount of time on this one. That's not to say it was a bad temple though, I kinda liked it, but it was pretty straightforward. Finally, there's the Water Temple. This one was by far the most frustrating of the whole group. Before making it to the pre-temple area, you have a number of side missions to complete, and they are all very unclear if you ask me. Once you find the red fish man, he tells you to go find the king. You go to the throne room, you remember, and there's some kids whispering about something. Turns out you can sneak up on them and learn where the king is. I was able to figure this out simply enough, which was great, but this was also the first time stealth came into play in a non-combat situation, so I'm just glad I thought of trying it since I initially tried sneaking up on the kids just as a joke. Once you find the king, he gives you these scales, and the red guy tells you to go find a sky island in the shape of a teardrop. But there are no islands that look like a teardrop. There was one that looks like a dolphin island that I assumed was important, so I went there, but I couldn't figure out what to do. Eventually, I broke down and had to Google the answer. Apparently, when you stand at just the right spot, the rocks floating around the island form a tear. But what does that matter? Now what? Well, it turns out you're supposed to shoot an arrow through it while attaching one of these scales the king gave you. Did I skip some dialogue that would have made this more plain? I tried to avoid Googling answers to puzzles, but this one had me stumped, and part of the problem was that I didn't even know where the puzzle was. And to be clear, I did actually reread the red guy, I don't know his name. I did reread the red fishman's dialogue over and over and over again, but I didn't reread the king's one, so maybe the king's dialogue would have helped with at least the arrow part, but not with finding the tier. The pre-dungeon area was also pretty samey to the Rito pre-dungeon area. It's just that instead of using floating boat mast trampolines, you were in a low gravity environment for some reason, and you used bubbles to help you get around. At long last, you make it to the temple itself, and it's hardly a temple at all. It's just a floating island where you can see the entire thing from the center of the area. This temple feels incredibly small and contained compared to the others. You can get from one puzzle to the other in no time at all. The puzzles weren't necessarily the easiest out of the bunch, and it's not inherently a bad thing to have a small temple, but this one was pretty unimpressive. Still liked it more than the fire temple since I didn't have to deal with minecart tracks, but I still wish this place had been put underwater. Once you complete the water temple, you are hit with a surprise! You're not done yet. First, you do a fake-out final boss fight at Hyrule Castle, but then you're told there's another person whose soul you need to harvest. You could have deduced this beforehand though, since there's 5 rings on Link's fingers and the others are already filled, but there's conspicuously one that's not. Now, first of all, I didn't have the camera yet because apparently there's a whole separate side quest I never discovered, and in order to finish the next step in the main quest line to find this final temple, I first had to get the camera. So I ended up looking up how to get the camera, did that, and took the picture I needed. I was then sent on a mission to this dragon-shaped river where I had to find this armor and do something, but I forget what. Regardless, the new Sky Island appeared, and after struggling with it for a hot second, it leads you to a final area where this masked thing shoots a laser that you're told to follow. So of course, I followed the laser, but it disappeared when I came to this monkey-looking statue. I stared at the statue for a while, completely lost as to what to do, trying all kinds of different things, but as it would turn out, I was supposed to bring the stupid masked laser thing with me, and there was flying devices nearby. I didn't even notice these flying devices before since I was told to go follow the laser, so I followed the laser. It never occurred to me to bring it along for the ride. Once I did this, at last you are brought to the true final temple. This one was enjoyable enough with 2 parts of the temple that I had no issue with and were pretty interesting, and 2 that I had lots of issues with. One part of the temple requires a certain balancing act that I didn't solve until I randomly moved the device around in frustration, and it suddenly worked. Few things are more frustrating than a puzzle you know the answer to, but for one reason or another, the device you made didn't work. Maybe I'm stupid, but I'm pretty sure I did this right. Then there was another part of the temple that was far away, and I probably spent a half hour or more just trying to figure out how to actually get there. Maybe I was just being dumb, but I did find this quite frustrating. Once you're finished though, you don't get a boss battle, but rather a massive robot to operate. Only problem is that this thing ate up battery in seconds, and thus was incredibly hard to use. I was going to mention this later, but I guess now is as good a time as any, but I never found out how to increase my battery's lifespan. I at least assume you are able to do this? I don't know what zonite or crystallized charges do, but I assume they are used to increase your battery's power, but I never found out how to do this or who to talk to. And that's not without trying either, I just had no clue where to start. I searched the tutorial Sky Island in the hopes that it was there, but found nothing. Pretty sure zonite can be used to buy charges, but that's it. So with a battery only as strong as it was at the very start of the game, this became a little bit of a slog where I largely ignored using the robot altogether. But that's it for the temples and their surrounding areas. Overall, the Gerudo Desert was the best all around in my opinion. And before we move on to the all-important horses, I also want to make a quick note that Tears of the Kingdom has several chests scattered around that give you armor pieces with special abilities. I absolutely love this. I don't know if there are these chests in Breath of the Wild since I never found any, but I found several in Tears of the Kingdom, and that few I found made me more eager to explore since I never knew if a chest would have an armor piece, and that kind of loot was worth way more than receiving a weak stick, a few arrows, or some other uninteresting item. Now, horses. Horses were really rough in Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom doesn't really improve them a whole lot. I do believe there were fewer situations though where a stick or a pebble would cause my horse to stop in his tracks, so at least that's good. They weren't necessarily better, but also were not worse. They did give them another use, which was pulling wagons, but I never did this since I saw no need, although you could attach a little Korok guy to the thing and drag them around, which is absolutely not a medieval form of torture. I felt that this game had more customization options for horses, although it still wasn't much. It's also possible I never found all or even hardly any of the customizable saddles and what have you in either game. But Tears of the Kingdom did have the horse point system, which incentivized you to actually catch horses, and some of these points are used to get you at least one saddle and bridle. There's also the Golden Horse, which I guess belongs to Zelda. When I saw this thing, I was super excited, but wasn't able to get it. Turns out there is a side mission you have to do to get the horse, and after accidentally stumbling upon that mission, I managed to have a golden horse steed whom I dubbed Mustard. I love this guy for all of the 5 minutes it took for the gold color to get a bit too yellow, I guess. I think the coloring is a bit too harsh and flat. If they made him glow a little or had some particle effect around him or something that added it a little more shine, then I think this would work a whole lot better, but the flashy gold just turned into a horse wearing a yellow skin suit in only a few minutes. But whatever, they added a few more things to horses, made them work a bit better, but there's still room for improvement. Before finishing the exploration section, I should also mention the Master Sword. In Breath of the Wild, I never found the thing and I was really disappointed. So I made a point of trying to find it this time. I did try to find it in Breath of the Wild, but I explored the whole map and didn't ever come across it. So I guess I was basically doing the same thing in Tears of the Kingdom, just with a little added determination. As it would turn out, I didn't even need to have that kind of determination though, since I came upon it on accident. At some point, I found myself in the deep for one reason or another, and I found this temple-looking thing that I assumed would lead me to the Korok Forest for some reason, despite having never found the Korok Forest in Breath of the Wild. Sure enough, that's where the temple thing actually led me, and the old Korok tree sent me on a journey to get the Master Sword, which was lodged in the head of a dragon, and since I love dragons, I absolutely loved retrieving the sword from its head. Okay, let's take a second to stretch because we're finally done with the exploration part of this video and we're heading into the combat section. I am the type of gamer who basically plays games for the combat. Yes, I play games that don't have a focus on it, but to me, this is the best part of all games, so it makes me really happy when they do combat well. Now, there isn't much of a point in talking about how fighting feels against your average enemies since it's basically the same as Breath of the Wild, with the exception that there's a few more enemies and some of the old ones will now charge you with horns on their heads, so we'll focus primarily on what makes the two games different, I guess. The most obvious difference is that in Breath of the Wild, weapons are weapons. That's about it. In Tears of the Kingdom, a weapon is little more than a mold for something stronger. One of your abilities merges monster parts to your weapons, giving them more power and or special abilities. The stronger the monster part, the stronger the weapon would become, and of course the base weapon's attack power also factored into the power of the weapon overall. One notable change this makes is that there's no longer elemental weapons, but rather just elemental monster parts, meaning anything can be an elemental weapon. There is, once again, 3 types of weapons: the one-handed, the two-handed, and the spear. In Breath of the Wild, I used two-handed weapons frequently enough, but in Tears of the Kingdom, I avoided them as much as physically possible. It feels like there were far fewer situations where knocking an enemy off a cliff was viable or necessary in this game, and their slower attack speed struggled to keep up with the larger monster hordes this game would throw at you. Although I must add the caveat that I did end up learning to like two-handed weapons again when I tried spinning, since that's a neat trick. And doing that can really work wonders against hordes, especially if it's a freezing weapon. But mostly these were relegated to being strong weapons I use for flurry rushes, since you don't have to worry about their slow attack speed at that point. Once again, spears were my favorite weapon type, and they felt to be a lot more plentiful in this game, which made me very happy. One-handed weapons were also pretty good, and they added more shield variety. I still find shield stats to be next to pointless and saw little meaning in the numbers next to them. The only thing that mattered to me was whether the shield was wooden or metal or looked cool. Now, you could use your abilities to attach things to shields for added effect, but this always made the shield look ugly, so I never used it. There are also times when attaching a certain monster part to a spear in particular would change it to a heavy weapon, which really annoyed me since I wanted a spear, not a two-hander, and as far as I could tell, there was nothing to indicate that fusing the parts would result in this. Overall, the weapons in the game were more dynamic and everything felt far more useful. Rather than fighting enemies for the weapons in their hands, you would fight them for the parts you could harvest from their corpses. This also meant that even a wooden stick could be useful with the right attachments, while in Breath of the Wild, a wooden stick was just that, a useless wooden stick. So there's a lot more incentive to fight, which makes me very happy, and I think it's just better design all around. But at the same time, I hated the fusion system for one reason. It looks awful. Now, not all fusions looked bad. Some of them appear to have had some amount of thought put into the design, but there were many fusions that looked absolutely ugly to the point where I would avoid using certain monster parts or fusing things to certain weapons because instead of making a cohesive weapon, it would just slap the part onto the stick or whatever with Elmer's glue and call it a day. Most weapons were also corroded and rusty and thus not very interesting to look at. Sure, it fits with the theme of the game, but I missed having the really cool and clean weapons you could find in Breath of the Wild. So although this one had better game design and variety, I quite simply didn't like how it looked, and that did impact my experience with the game. Swinging around an epic sword feels very different from swinging around a lizard horn. I was going to mention raids or war parties as I called them earlier at this point, but I guess I already covered them, so there isn't a whole lot to add. I just wanted to reiterate, I wish there was more of them, or at least more that I found in my experience. I also mentioned the Colosseum I found in the deep near the Fire Temple, and I'm glad I remembered to mention it. I only came across one of these, and once again, I wish there were more of them. The whole thing is basically a survive the waves enemies event, so I suppose there isn't a whole lot to talk about. I just thought it was fun, and I got Zan's helmet for my troubles. I should also mention before I forget that arrows were leaps and bounds easier to find in this game, and very unlike Breath of the Wild where I would need to buy a whole bunch of arrows and would try to conserve them, but in Tears of the Kingdom, I didn't really need to, and I really liked this. Probably because I just like being an archer and I found myself using bows frequently early game and still quite often later in the game. I was also much less hesitant to draw them out than I was in Breath of the Wild since there are no special arrows, but arrows inherit the abilities of whatever you attach to them. I also didn't have to worry about the types of arrows I had on hand and preserve certain ones for fear of not having them in the future. Finally, let's get to the bosses and mini-bosses, and of course we'll talk mini-bosses first. Breath of the Wild had Lionels all around the world, and although they were sort of rare, you would still find at least one, I think, in each of the sections of the map, so they weren't uncommon either. But in Tears of the Kingdom, I encountered maybe 2 of them during normal exploration, and then another whom you had to fight before Ganondorf. The Lionels in this game were basically the same as they were in Breath of the Wild, if not entirely exactly the same, but it felt as though they were much easier to take down. They also dropped weapons and monster parts that were far more worth the effort than they were in Breath of the Wild. In fact, one of the parts from the Lionel before Ganondorf helped tremendously during my fight against him. There are stone taluses, but once again, I hardly ever ran into them, but they did at least have some more interesting things going on with them. There was one talus with platforms built on top of it and bokoblins standing on the platform. It was funny to see and a fun fight. There was also a fiery stone talus in the Goron area, and I was never able to beat it because I found it quite hard to deal damage to it. There were also the Hands of Death that would attack you unprompted, and these things were genuinely terrifying. It wasn't until about halfway through the game I tried fighting these things, and of course, you're forced to beat one inside the big Korok tree. Well, I guess not forced, but I decided to do that, and once the hands are gone, a Shadow Ganon appears to ruin your day, but not because he's necessarily hard to beat, but because the much harder portion of the fight wasn't over yet. Overall, I like these guys. Oh, and there were Hinox again and some sort of skeleton variant in the deep, but they were just about as interesting as they were in the last game. The most noticeable mini-boss, though, is the Gleeok, though I just called them dragons. These guys appear to have replaced the Lionel with their frequency, and I found them all over the map like the Lionel in Breath of the Wild. Unlike the Lionel, however, these things were terrifyingly strong. And, well, I guess I should clarify, unlike the Lionel in Tears of the Kingdom, in Breath of the Wild, Lionel were kind of terrifyingly strong, but not nearly as strong as the Gleeok in Tears of the Kingdom. I approached them a few times early on to gauge their strength and was absolutely torn apart. Then I gained more strength and tried again, but was still unable to take out the 3 eyes, which would down the dragon and allow me to actually deal damage. It was after this fight though that a friend of mine saw me struggling and pointed out that attaching Keith's eyes to an arrow makes them homing arrows, and that changed everything. After some time, I took down another Gleeok while armed with this knowledge. It was still a long and hard-fought battle, and it's hard to think of what to say about it. All that comes to mind is that this Gleeok fight was leagues and bounds more fun than any of the temple bosses. It took longer and required more strategy and careful maneuvering. This beast, this mini-boss, was actually the most fun part of the entire game in my opinion, and once I finally conquered the beast, I was so excited to see what it dropped. After all, it had to be good considering how difficult he was. But when I picked up the monster parts, I was quite disappointed and had flashbacks to the Lionel drops from Breath of the Wild. I went through several weapons and many bundles of arrows to take it down and received 3 monster parts that were sure strong and had elemental abilities, but I guess I expected them to be 10 or 20 points stronger than they were. Despite having been the most fun part of the game, I never fought another Gleeok because I didn't think they were worth the effort, time, and resources. I kind of regret not beating each of the elemental types of Gleeok though, just to see what the others would do, but I guess that's okay. Maybe I'll have to jump on another day to see what they can do. Now there are some other mini-bosses like these toads in the deep and the sand shark thing in the Gerudo Desert who terrified me. I killed the toad on my first try, so that wasn't a big deal, and the desert shark I ran into once and never saw again and never bothered to fight. If I did play this game again, then I'd probably return to the desert and try to take one of these things down. There's also the Flux Construct bosses you'll find in the Sky Islands. I found those bosses to be really interesting and am quite a big fan of their design, though outside of the one I took down while in Tutorial Island, they were kind of stupidly easy to beat. Let's finally get to the temple bosses then, and we'll do those in the same order as we did the temples in. So first up is Queen Gibdo, who was probably the most interesting boss overall, even if she wasn't my favorite. She had several different kinds of attacks and patterns, and her phases were overall the most interesting. You would have to shoot her down and then attack her with elemental blades, but you also had to be careful about when you attacked because she could slap back just as hard. To get her to the ground in the first place, you had to shoot her with an arrow, but she actually dashes around a bit to make it harder to hit her. Not super hard, but harder than a still target. In second phase, she summons a bunch of minions you have to deal with. Overall, she was the best designed temple boss fight with plenty of stages, attacks, and counterattacks, and potential strategies to use against her. She also took the longest to beat, but I think the length of time was appropriate for a boss fight, while the others felt too fast. Next up is the Marble Goma, who was the most forgettable of the boss battles. It would shoot rocks at you, and you would have to break them before they exploded, and then you would have to shoot your Goron friend into its legs, and while it was down on the ground, you would run up to it and smack its eye around. Serviceable, but nothing special. Now the Rito was by far the easiest, while also being my favorite. First off, the boss just looks awesome, and I love the music for this one. I often don't notice the music, but this one just hit differently. For the fight, you're thrown into the air and it hovers below you, shaking off ice rocks that you have to dodge while diving into its crystal parts. It's not exactly the hardest, but I really enjoyed the skydiving aspect of it, as well as the fact that you're diving into the line of fire. I quite enjoy that. Then after you beat its first phase, it starts teleporting through tears in space-time. This ability alone should make it more powerful than Ganondorf, but instead, it just uses the portals to try and sneak up on you, which is fine. Thing is though, in the second form, I thought to myself, wait, when it flies by, the crystal parts are wide open, and if I slow things down with arrow time, could I just shoot the crystals and be done with it in 5 seconds? The answer to that was yes. So the boss went down after a very short fight, which sucked. I wish this boss was 3 or 4 times longer because it's crazy cool. The final boss of the temples was a little squid man who was stripped right out of Splatoon. He shoots gunk that slows you down while he jumps between different gunk spots, and in order to deal with him, you either need to use a water weapon, throw a water fruit or something, or use your water ability. I think this boss is supposed to just be annoying by slowing you down, but I actually found him pretty easy to figure out. I basically just waited for him to jump to a lone puddle with only one option for escape, and then I would just wait by that puddle and poke him with my spear. This was another short fight, and the boss was really disappointing. Small bosses can be fine, and I often prefer them actually, but this little squid man was a bit boring to look at. He did turn into a mud shark, which was kinda cool, but mostly I felt like I was stabbing a Splatoon squid kid with a long fork. The surprise 5th boss was fun in concept, but not really in execution. You're thrown into an arena and suddenly it's smash 'em mash 'em robots. This can be fun, but it was stupidly easy to win, even with my massive handicap of having next to no battery life. So let's get to the final boss, the big baddie of the Zelda games, Ganondorf. Now I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fake-out Ganondorf fight that occurs after taking down the first 4 temples. Before getting to the actual boss fight, you have to do several small waves of enemies in different locations around Hyrule Castle. Each of these locations require a little bit of exploring, and Zelda is always ominously standing out in the open awaiting your arrival. I quite enjoyed this part of the game, and the fake-out Ganondorf battle was pretty fun, all things considered. But of course, that's the fake-out boss battle, so let's move to the real one. There's some traveling you need to do to get there, and there's a Lionel in the way. I suppose it's possible you could slip past him, but he drops really good monster parts and a very strong bow, so I think it was best to take him down. After running for a bit, you come to an open area where you fight large waves of enemies. At first, I was a little concerned since I wasn't sure I could fight off so many at once, but then your allies come and help you and they make it more than manageable. This is also where spinning with a 2-handed ice weapon really shined. Maybe the whole ordeal was too easy, but it was super fun. Then you get to the actual boss fight. At first, Ganondorf attacks you in the same way as the Shadow variants did, so it's pretty simple to start. I also discovered you can spam arrows, and with a little accuracy and precision, you can clear this part without even using a sword. Once you beat his first form though, he decides to get serious and transforms. And this moment where Ganondorf's health bar just doesn't stop was absolutely awesome. What a great use of the health bar to startle the player. Legitimately one of the best parts in the game. In this form, he summons some doubles and your friends help deal with them while you try to focus on the main body. The clones can sometimes attack you and you have to keep an eye out for them, but overall, they're not that big of a deal. Once the health bar is down, the clones go away and your friends are pushed away, leaving you mano a mano. This time, Ganondorf alternates between, I believe, 4 weapons, and he has different attack patterns, and instead of dodging once, you have to dodge him twice. I guess he also does switch weapons before this part too, but whatever. So after the first attempt at Flurry Rush, he'll dodge you, and you have maybe a second to read the next attack and dodge appropriately. It sounds easy enough, but was shockingly tough. Although another thing about Ganondorf is that the first time he flurry dodges you gives you a mini heart attack, and it's just another piece of great game design. Taking something the player often relies on and is used as a powerful tool in combat is turned against you in this fight. Granted, I never got hit by him after any of these dodges, as it was pretty easy to dodge his next attack, but just seeing the dodge was enough to make your heart skip a beat. Of course, a Ganondorf fight wouldn't be complete without him turning into some sort of beast, and this time he transforms into a dragon, and I love dragons. This makes me so happy. And then the light dragon swoops on by and picks you up, and for a moment I was hoping this would be a dragon on dragon fight, but unfortunately it was not. The light dragon instead brings you up high into the sky, at which point you jump down and hit some bulbs along the demon dragon's back. I was so hopeful for this fight, but it was actually pretty lame. It seems to me the Zelda games struggle a bit with the big beast fights. They always feel way too easy to me. Although I will say it took me almost a half hour to kill the demon dragon because I did so little damage to him. The whole time I used arrows to shoot the orbs, but a friend of mine said he was able to walk along the dragon's back and whack these things with a sword and kill it much faster. But when I played it, I could have sworn that whenever I even touched the dragon, that I lost hearts permanently. So I avoided landing on him since any damage resulted in unrecoverable heart loss. The final shot felt really good, but overall the battle dragged on quite long and was really easy. Okay, this video has already gone on way too long. So let's rapid fire a few things I haven't had the chance to mention yet. Climbing in the rain was a big complaint for me in the original game, and Tears of the Kingdom is no better. There's potions that are supposed to make you stick better, but I couldn't tell the difference for the life of me. There was also a frog armor that supposedly works a lot better, and I found it, but I had to do who knows how many side quests at who knows how many stables to get that armor, and I had already explored the entire map by the time I found this quest, and I was in let's finish the game mode. In all likelihood, I skipped over half of the side quests available in this game, or well, probably more, since I don't usually enjoy side quests, but this means there's plenty more content that could be fun. The spirit pals that give you special abilities are both great and suck because there were so many times I wanted to use their ability, but they were busy being inches away from the enemies, so I couldn't get to them, and this caused my death a few times. Having 2 spirits was the most annoying I found, though once you get 4, it actually got better because the extras would keep the monsters off you and the one you wanted. I also haven't a clue what the post spirits in the deep are used for, and of course I already mentioned how I never figured out the purpose of Zonite. There are spirit frogs and blue bunnies you can find around the world, and the frog parts are used for some special things like armor that consumes rupees and keeps you from taking damage, and the bunnies can be shot with arrows for money. There are great fairies who didn't require money to open up, but instead side quest, and doing so was kind of just meh. The dragons flying around were super awesome because I love dragons once again, and unlike Breath of the Wild, I was actually able to get really close to these dragons, so that made me really happy. And that's everything I can think of to mention. Of course, there's plenty more, but let's wrap things up. Oh, actually, no. At the very end of the game, you're supposed to catch Zelda as she's falling, and I decided not to do that. So I just let her fall and I just wanted to see what happened. Would she hit the ground? What would happen? And I discovered at one point that I actually wasn't moving anymore. They had the whole wind effects that gave the illusion of movement, but you weren't moving anymore. And I just think that was really funny, or maybe it just shows that I'm a bad person. I don't know, but that was worth mentioning, I think. Okay, time to consider the question I mentioned at the start of this video. Does this game deserve to exist? Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are very similar games, although you could say that any sequel to a game should be similar to the original, as it should maintain its identity. Sequels often improve on many aspects of the original, and Tears of the Kingdom does that. But at the same time, you're on the same map doing a lot of the same things. There's 2 new layers to the map now, the surface looks a bit different, and many key locations are now in different locations, such as the shrines and towers. The whole time I played the game and the whole time I've been writing the script for the video, I've been thinking to myself whether this game was really worth it. There used to be only one Zelda game for every console, and the only previous exception I'm aware of was the Wii, where there's Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword. Now those 2 games are wildly different games, but now the only other 2 Zelda games on the same console, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, are direct sequels of each other. In many ways, they are the same game, but in many ways, they're 2 different games. I do admit my view on these games is likely a bit different than most people playing Tears of the Kingdom, since I played Breath of the Wild for the first time a few short months ago, while many other people likely played it many years ago. Perhaps they replayed it before trying the sequel, but I wonder if my experience and view of the game would be entirely different if I had had years to forget the world of Breath of the Wild, and if I had had time to really stew on it. Now this game is one of a new wave of games where they slap that $70 price tag on you, which of course is a steep price. But I did end up spending 40 hours in this game, and a friend of mine spent 150. And all 40 of my hours were even a little rushed so I could ensure this video came out in time. There were still many more hours I could have happily spent in the game if I had wanted to. Of course, you have to make a decision as to whether this is a good value for you. After all, some people don't have 40 hours to spend on a game. Was it worth it to me? Yeah, I guess so. Which would also answer the question as to whether I think this game deserves to exist. I think it makes enough changes to be fresh and different enough that there's a solid argument to be had as to which one is better. And it's maybe unfair to expect that this game changes the gaming landscape and defines a genre just like its predecessor did. I also, to this day, still don't know which one I would really prefer. I think Tears of the Kingdom is a better game in just about every way, and yet I am hesitant to say I like it better. And the reason for this is seemingly small. I mentioned earlier that I didn't like how weapons look, and that alone is enough of a hurdle to prevent me from declaring Tears of the Kingdom to be a better game. The game's style and color and feel was darker to me than Breath of the Wild, although I would say I prefer the Skyware green aesthetic over the ancient bluish black-orange of Breath of the Wild. There's also the fact that Breath of the Wild gives you the freedom to skip parts of the game entirely, while Tears of the Kingdom requires you to do all the main quest lines to finish it. I personally don't care about this, but the lesson freedom could still be felt. I think I would have to say I would pick up Tears of the Kingdom first, but I miss the beautiful weapon designs of the first one, and as ridiculous as that sounds, even as I'm saying it right now, that alone held back the game in my opinion. But what do you think? Which of the two would you prefer and why? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. If I had to give it a rating, I'd probably give it a 9 out of 10. It's a solid game, and if you've ever been considering it and have the money available to purchase it, I would definitely say it's worth the hype.